This has never happened before. Not once. Not in the modern era. Not in the steroid era. Not in any era of professional baseball that anyone sitting in that press conference room had ever covered, analyzed, or lived through. A 5-4-1 trade. 5 players moving in one direction. 1 player moving in the other. And that one player, that single name traveling from Detroit to Los Angeles, was Tarik Skubal. The room didn't erupt immediately when the news broke. There was a pause first. The kind of pause that happens when information arrives that the brain needs an extra second to process. Because the numbers didn't make immediate sense. Because 5 players is not a trade. 5 players is a statement. 5 players is an organization looking at the rest of the league and saying, without any ambiguity, that it understands exactly what it has and exactly what it is willing to pay to keep the window open. And then came the second piece of news. Skubal had rejected the Mets. Flatly. Completely. Without negotiation. Without a counteroffer. Without leaving the door even slightly open for New York to walk back through. The Mets had made their case. They had presented their vision. They had offered him a path. And Skubal had looked at all of it, weighed it against what Los Angeles was offering, and said no. 5 years. Dodgers uniform. That was the answer. Let's go back to where this started. Because this story didn't begin with a phone call between front offices. It began months ago, in the quiet spaces between games, when Andrew Friedman started asking a question that every great front office eventually has to ask. What is missing? Not what is broken. Not what is failing. The Dodgers were not a team in crisis. They were not scrambling to patch holes. They were operating, as they almost always operate, from a position of controlled strength. But Friedman has never been satisfied with strength that isn't growing. He has never looked at a roster that was performing and decided that performing was enough. He looked at his rotation. He looked at what was coming in October. He looked at the kind of pitching that wins in the postseason, not just the regular season, not just the comfortable mid-May games against beatable lineups, but the October games, the elimination games, the games where the margin between winning and losing is measured in single pitches, and he decided that what the Dodgers had was very good. Very good was not going to be enough. Tarik Skubal was the answer to a question Friedman had been sitting with for a long time. To understand why the Dodgers were willing to move 5 players for 1 arm, you have to understand what Skubal represents. Not just statistically. Not just in terms of ERA and strikeout rate and WHIP and all the numbers that fill up the analytical spreadsheets that every front office now lives inside. You have to understand what he represents as a pitcher in the truest sense of the word. He is not a thrower. He is not a power arm who overwhelms hitters with velocity alone and hopes the defense does the rest. He is a pitcher. He thinks. He adjusts. He remembers what he threw to a hitter 3 at-bats ago and uses that memory as a weapon 3 weeks later. He operates with the kind of intelligence on the mound that cannot be taught in a minor league system. That cannot be developed through coaching and repetition alone. That either exists inside a pitcher or it doesn't. In Skubal, it exists. Detroit knew what they had. They were not trading him out of weakness. They were not a franchise in desperation, selling assets to survive another difficult season. They were a team making a calculated decision about their timeline. About what they needed now versus what they needed in 3 years. About which direction their rebuild was pointing. And when the Dodgers came to the table with 5 pieces, 5 legitimate, evaluated, scouted pieces, Detroit decided that the return was worth the loss. That conversation between the 2 front offices was not short. It was not easy. And at several points, it was not certain. The Mets were in that conversation too. They had pursued Skubal with the kind of urgency that comes from an organization that believes it is 1 arm away from a legitimate championship run. Steve Cohen's organization has spent heavily, has assembled talent aggressively, and has made clear to the league that it intends to compete at the highest level for as long as it takes. Adding Skubal to their rotation would have transformed them. It would have given them a frontline starter capable of carrying a postseason series on his back. They made their case. They were competitive. They were serious. And Skubal said no. That detail is not a footnote. That detail is the center of this story. Because Skubal had the right to choose. He had the leverage that elite players eventually accumulate, the leverage of being wanted by multiple organizations, of being able to look at two different visions for his next 5 years and select the one that matched what he believed about himself and his career. He chose Los Angeles. He chose the organization that already has Shohei Ohtani. The organization that already has a rotation that rivals are already concerned about. The organization that doesn't just sign players to fill roster spots but builds environments where the right players become better versions of themselves. When he made that choice, it said something about what he believes the Dodgers are capable of in October. And when a pitcher of his caliber makes that statement with his decision, the rest of the league is required to pay attention. Now look at what the Dodgers gave up. Kim Hye-sung. Rojas. Rushing. 3 names that carry their own weight inside this organization. Players who had futures here, or at least futures that were still being written. Players who had worn that uniform and understood what it meant to be part of a machine that operates at this level of expectation every single day. The urgency of the trades involving those 3 was not accidental. Friedman did not move slowly. He did not allow the situation to breathe and develop at its own pace. The moment the Skubal acquisition was confirmed, the decisions around Kim, Rojas, and Rushing were already in motion. Already communicated. Already finalized in the way that only the most organized front offices in baseball are capable of finalizing things simultaneously. Kim Hye-sung's departure carries a particular weight. A player who arrived with considerable expectation, who represented something meaningful not just to the franchise but to a specific community of fans who had followed his career with intense investment. His exit from Los Angeles is not a commentary on his ability. It is a commentary on the arithmetic of roster construction at the highest level. When you add something significant, you must subtract something significant. The math is unforgiving. Rojas goes with the kind of quiet efficiency that characterizes the Dodgers' handling of roster transitions. No drama. No public negotiation. No hint that this was coming until it had already arrived. And Rushing, perhaps the most interesting piece in this entire transaction, represents the future that Los Angeles decided to trade away in pursuit of the present. That is the bet Friedman is making. That this window, this specific collection of players, this specific alignment of talent and health and timing, is worth prioritizing over what might develop in 3 or 4 years. That the cost of waiting is higher than the cost of moving now. Dave Roberts received this news the way he receives most significant roster developments. With the expression of a manager who has already been thinking about how to use the new piece before the piece officially existed on his roster. When reporters gathered to ask him about Skubal, Roberts didn't perform excitement. He didn't reach for superlatives or manufacture enthusiasm for the cameras. He spoke the way he always speaks when he genuinely believes in what his organization has done. He was measured. He was specific. And the specificity was the giveaway. He talked about Skubal's ability to work deep into games. About the way his stuff plays differently in the late innings than most pitchers at his level, because his mechanics stay consistent in a way that allows his velocity and movement to remain stable when other starters are fading. He talked about what that means in October specifically. About how a postseason rotation built around 2 arms capable of pitching into the 7th and 8th inning changes the calculus of bullpen management entirely. He was not describing a pitcher he had just met. He was describing a pitcher his staff had studied for a long time. Somewhere in a Detroit facility, there are 5 players preparing to become Tigers. Preparing to enter an organization that is building towards something, that has a vision for what it wants to be in the coming years, that sees in these 5 pieces parts of the answer to its own questions. The transition will not be easy for all of them. Transitions never are. Leaving a championship-caliber environment and entering a rebuilding one requires a mental adjustment that statistics cannot capture. But for Detroit, this is not a moment of defeat. It is a moment of investment. The return they received represents young talent, organizational depth, future flexibility. The kind of assets that allow a front office to construct something from the ground up rather than inheriting a roster and trying to reshape it around the edges. For the Dodgers, this is not the end of their activity. It is an acceleration of it. The Skubal acquisition does not close the book on what Friedman is building. It opens the next chapter. And the next chapter, with 13 pitchers now on an active list that includes both Ohtani and Skubal, is one that the rest of the National League is going to be reading very carefully. The Mets will regroup. They will find another answer. They have the resources and the willingness to keep pursuing. But there will be a moment, sometime in October, when the Mets front office watches Tarik Skubal take the mound in a Dodgers uniform in an elimination game and sits with the weight of what could have been. That moment is not yet here. But the foundation for it was laid the day Skubal looked at everything New York was offering and decided it wasn't where he was supposed to be. There is a version of the Dodgers that exists in the imagination of everyone who has watched this organization operate over the last decade. A version that wins not because it outspends everyone else, though it does spend. Not because it outanalyzes everyone else, though it does analyze. But because it understands something fundamental about what championship baseball actually requires. It requires the right people making the right decisions at the right moments. It requires a front office willing to move 5 players to get 1. It requires a manager willing to stand in front of a microphone and explain, without apology, why the players who left had to leave. It requires a superstar willing to exist inside a system rather than above it. And it requires a pitcher. A real one. The kind who thinks on the mound. The kind who remembers. The kind who arrives in a new city wearing a new uniform and immediately understands that the expectation here is not to be good. The expectation is to win. Tarik Skubal already knew that when he said no to New York. He chose this. And the league now has to live with that choice.